Welcome to the Journalism Innovation Podcast, where we bring you the most interesting perspectives and insights from media entrepreneurs and publishers at the heart of news innovation in Europe. I'm your host, Tara Kelly, and in this episode, we discuss how to design a generative AI-led newsroom to strengthen and reimagine your media business. To better understand the practicalities and challenges of harnessing this technology, we sat down with two experts. George Montagu, head of insights at FT Strategies, who holds an expertise in the media industry and its accompanying business models, and has worked on high-profile projects like the News Sustainability Project, and with organizations like the National Theatre and various leading European news publishers. We also have Nikita Roy joining us, a data scientist, journalist, and media entrepreneur who co-founded the NRA Nation and is host of the Newsroom Robots podcast. Her focus is on responsible and innovative use of AI in the newsrooms through consulting, training, and by developing AI products. With their mix of consultancy experience, the pair share a slew of generative AI newsroom use cases, along with the various challenges small startups and large legacy media must consider before experimenting in this space. We also discuss how generative AI could help or hamper media businesses, depending on how it's deployed. The Journalism Innovation Podcast is part of the European Journalism Center's Journalism Innovation Network, a newly launched initiative for media entrepreneurs and news innovators looking for a space to connect, learn, and thrive. To join, head over to ejc.net/network. This podcast network is made possible with the support of the Google News Initiative. Now let's take a listen to our conversation with George Montagu and Nikita Roy. George and Nikita, welcome to the Journalism Innovation Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
It's great to have you guys both on here. I thought it would be best if perhaps the two of you could just introduce yourselves and your roles and just tell me a little bit about your interest in AI and media.
Nikita, do you want to start?
Sure. I actually wear quite different hats. I would say I'm currently a Knight Fellow at the International Center for Journalists. And my start in the news industry actually happened because I founded a publication called the NRA Nation for the Indian diaspora. And what I'm most known, I would say, for my work right now in the industry is the podcast I host, which is Newsroom Robots. It all started mainly because I was completing my data science master's degree last year. And as a publisher, and generative AI was this big thing that came onto the scene. And as a publisher, I was trying to understand more in terms of how should I be thinking about it. And I was working on a capstone as well, working on recommendation algorithms for local news. And so at the same time, I decided, let me start talking to more people and understand more about how AI is being implemented within the news industry and to help inform myself, but also make it available for everyone as the public. And right now, I also do a lot of trainings for newsrooms globally on AI. And we just kicked off and launched, I'll be leading the AI Journalism Lab here at the Craig Newmark School of Journalism at CUNY in partnership with Microsoft.
Marvelous. George?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'm George Montagu. I work for FT Strategies. FT Strategies is basically the consulting arm of the FT. So we provide advice to media organizations on basically how to achieve financial sustainability is really our mantra. My background is across all sorts within, I guess, the media practitioner space. So I've worked in data, I've worked on the commercial side of the business. I've also worked on the regulatory and legal side. So this is the intersection, as in artificial intelligence, of really all of those things. So what I really want to understand is, how can AI be used in a way that helps create better audience engagement, but also creates a sustainable financial model for news publishing?
Brilliant. And I think it would be best, Nikita, if we start with you. You're a data scientist. You're also founder and publisher of NRI Media, as you said. So I wonder if you could just tell us about your use of AI in your work and in your publication.
Yeah, I think that's a question I get asked a lot hosting the Newsroom Robots podcast. I have a couple different media publications. A lot of it I see is on the side of helping me be more productive as a person. And I think we talk a lot about the publications, but it is all about empowering myself and my team with using these generative AI tools. As I said, I do a lot of these newsroom AI trainings. And so at the same time, for me, it's about getting my team more equipped in AI knowledge, and especially about using it as a brainstorming companion, using it to be able to produce much better quality work. ChatGPT is something that we were on the scene using quite extensively to be able to brainstorm ideas. If you come into our meetings, we always have our AI bot. It's between Otter. Right now, we tried out fireflies.ai. We have these meeting bots that help us summarize our meetings, be able to track all of our different ideas that we're thinking about, so that it's just helping us be able to create reports quicker that we need to be working on. And for the NRI Nation, I'd written about this. We were experimenting with different types of formats. For example, trying to create news quizzes, and we built out a Google Doc extension basically because a lot of our work just happens on Google Docs before it goes to the CMS, and so we just have a basic extension that helps us with generating headlines. It helps us with social media copy, being able to be a mini editing tool. A little bit of that is me being a data scientist and a coder. I just like getting into the weeds of it and experimenting with it. But that's all that happens over there. But as well as the newsroom robot side, the podcast, it's a lot of brainstorming that I do. The way I see it is before I write anything, it always gets proofread and copy edited first by ChatGPT or a version of that. I fluctuate between ChatGPT and Claude right now. I use that a lot more before it even goes to my editor. So he has a much quicker time and it's more productive. So I really see it in terms of building a culture of working with these tools side by side, not for them to write our content, but instead as a brainstorming partner and as a productivity gain, basically.
Brilliant. And you also host that podcast that you mentioned, Newsroom Robots. What are some of the things that you've come across, in newsrooms and also in the trainings that you're doing? What are some innovations that people are using in the newsroom?
Yeah, a lot of it right now, if you're talking generative AI specific, has been in the operational sides of the newsroom. So helping with transcription, translation, again, generating interview questions, story ideas, social media headlines, all of that. But actually, AI has really been a part of the news industry for over a decade at this point, at least. The Associated Press back in 2015 had started producing all of these automated earnings report that went them from covering almost 300 to nearly 3,000 per quarter. And that's just an example that we have that for sports stories, housing articles, COVID articles. That's already been a part of the industry, being able to write articles on top of structured data. What's new with generative AI is really this ability of putting an input and generating a completely new output. So I feel like a lot of newsrooms, especially the bigger ones, had this experience with AI. And a lot of the experiences that I'm seeing right now, what generative AI is doing different is giving local news publishers the ability to experiment and prototype with it because of the accessibility nature of generative AI, where you don't necessarily need to have a full data scientist team. I am a data scientist, but right now, a lot of my code, it just gets written by generative AI. And all I do is just being able to figure things out. I'm doing a lot more coding. I never knew how to build a Google Doc extension. And generative AI, ChatGPT, walked me through the process and helped write the code. And all I had to do was be able to figure things out that way. And you just needed a basic knowledge. But so that's where I think the innovation that you're really seeing is going to be in the local news. Here in Toronto, where I'm here right now, we have a publication called Torontoverse. And what they did was they built out a chatbot that connects to the municipal data. So you can go and ask questions in terms of what has the police spending budget been over the past few years? And it goes, extracts the data, puts it in a graph that you can go and see. So it's just a small publication being able to democratize information that I'm seeing. So there's just a lot of examples that I'm coming across with local news, especially helping them on the operation sides of the newsroom.
Fascinating. And it's really interesting to hear how you're kind of marrying your data science background with this new innovation, and it's saving you time, but you also can catch things and you have the knowledge in the background to, to pick up when things don't go right, which can happen. But yeah. And George, as head of insights at FT Strategies, I'm sure you're coming across lots of really interesting uses of this in your consultancy work. So I wonder if you could just talk a bit about, the trends you're seeing and any insight there.
Sure, yeah. I think, we've all seen these really popular use cases that Nikita mentioned. So I'll try to avoid dwelling on those too much. I think what I'm really excited about is there's a lot of evidence that content needs to be adapted to meet different readers' needs. And I get really excited about multimodal AI and what that could offer us in terms of like formats that better suit the specific needs of the individual at that moment in time within their life. Because ultimately, all of us prefer different formats. All of us are in different situations throughout the day. And therefore, having a universal 800-word article to consume every single time you want to receive the news is really quite problematic for most people, and actually really leads to a lot of disengagement simply down to format rather than necessarily interest. So I think that's really exciting. There's loads of examples of like the BBC doing some experimentation in that space as far as I see it. I don't love all of these TV presenters that are popping up that have like the AI faces. I'm not into that yet, but I guess we'll wait and see. The only other thing that I do quite like, actually, one example is a Nordic publisher. I think it's Aftonblad, and they've got a add-on that allows you to change the body of the text so that it works for an 18-year-old. And why I find that so interesting is if you actually look at the average reading age of people in the US, I believe it's something around 14 or 15 years old. And then you look at the content of some of the leading publications, that's college level content. And I think the ability to simplify content without it being simplistic, if that makes sense, I think is really exciting and could lead to a whole new category of people being more engaged with the news.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, when I was at CNN, we were even being pressured and pushed to sort of rethink formats and go beyond the 800-word article because we were on the more of the content studio side where, special projects, and there was a lot of push towards, data viz and interactive content. But I think you're right. It's also about the actual text itself and that experience. It's not just really cool interactives, right? It's there's so many different things you can do with this. It's just really endless.
But what will be interesting is, you mentioned that journalists have been thinking more about storytelling formats, but with the advent of generative AI, will it actually put the power of the format in the hands of the reader, and therefore mean that journalists actually don't need to think about storytelling formats as much? Will there be a reversal? I don't know, but it's interesting to think about.
And I wonder, in terms of ethics, I think sometimes, I don't know, maybe you come across this when you're consulting, people just don't necessarily want to experiment because they're afraid of the unknown, essentially, the Armageddon of generative AI. And I'm sure, Nikita, you've come across this too. It's in your training. How do we kind of encourage publishers to sort of put back this financially and hire the right people and get the right people in place so we can innovate and we can, experiment and understand that there might be some challenges along the way, but you can't just put your head in the sand and ignore this. This is here. This is now. So I'd like to hear from both of you. What your perspective is on that from an ethics and innovation perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the main things is we need to foster a dialogue on AI continuously within the newsrooms. One thing when I go in is usually they'll call me and then we do a training, but I'm like, what's happening after I leave from the newsroom? How are you talking about AI? How are you getting use cases within your newsroom? The fact is, when I usually talk to people and I ask executives, how is your newsroom using AI? How are your journalists or people in your newsroom using AI? There's no like laundry list of use cases yet or understanding especially. So one thing I always talk about is maybe like having like a Slack channel or a group where you have like AI use cases, AI wins, where people are come across a tool or come across a use case and then they share. I tried it for like making this into a TikTok script and it helped me really well. And this is kind of the prompt that I use. Or I just tried out Google Gemini that came out and it's able to produce outputs better than ChatGPT for this particular scenario. That way you're able to create shared institutional knowledge on AI. But at the same time, you have like an AI fails area where you're continuously talking about, oh, it's not able, it was hallucinating when I gave it this kind of like PDF report to help me do research. I guess using GPT for research is not a good idea, you know? Like all of those conversations need to be continuously happening within the newsroom to build, first of all, transparency within the entire newsroom in terms of how are people within the newsroom using AI? Because usually there are pockets of people using AI, others are not at all using AI. And by doing this, everybody comes onto the same board to understand what are the examples, what's okay, what's not okay. And if they accidentally do something that is maybe a bit risky, you as the leader are able to understand quite quickly that, okay, maybe we should include something more clarifying within our AI guidelines to say this is not a good use case for AI. So what I really talk about is being an advocate for responsible AI by being transparent within the newsroom and building shared institutional knowledge on how AI is being used.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I love listening to Nikita like talk about all of those experiments that she's been running with her publications, because the fact of the matter is large institutions, it's entirely different. You know, the bureaucracy is real, and so is the risk to our brand. So at the FT, anecdotally, obviously, we focus a lot on governance. So governance is definitely not the sexiest of topics, but we do have at the FT what we've called the Data Governance Council. And essentially that's board representatives from across the business. So you've got someone from commercial, someone from product, someone from editorial, all represented. And basically they'll meet on a monthly basis to talk about, for example, any initiatives that we want to run or any new use cases that we want to use AI for. And then they'll discuss and debate, you know, what are the commercial advantages versus what are the potential ethical trade-offs. And I think the reason why that's so important is that there is no established regulatory framework to guide us in using this new technology. So there's a degree of subjectivity and like risk versus reward decision making. And ultimately, that needs to be collective rather than sit on one individual within the organization. So that's kind of how we've done it. And to Nikita's point, we have a log of all AI use cases across the FT, which is a fascinating read. And then it's got a status next to it. So it's like approved, like experimenting with, and then like not for now. And that's just a great way for everyone to see as well, like, can I make use of this use case, or can I also use this technology, which is quite nice.
The FT strategies team gave an amazing webinar, I think last year, sort of looking at the different trends. And you did a poll with some of the people who joined that, and you asked them about like how are they using AI? Are they using third-party tools? Are they building a team in-house? Like, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those insights and yeah, just share with us what your findings were from that.
Sure. Yeah, I think when we were discussing it last year, the world was a very different place. I think a lot of the Copilot apps and a lot of the add-ons within like SaaS platforms didn't exist. and everyone was kind of excited about, like, we can use large language models to build these new tools, and it's going to be really, really exciting. Like, let's put teams together and let's get developers to start working on these things. I think what's emerged, to be honest, in the last few months is that these tools are going to be available within like your existing tech stack. Like, I don't see loads of use cases where you should build your own technology, because to be honest, if you wait, it will probably turn up in the platforms that you use eventually anyway. So just to use an example, for our consulting practice, we have tons of information and intellectual property about past clients and about research that we've done. We thought to ourselves, imagine like an LLM chatbot that you could interface with all of our research and all of our intellectual property. And like, shock horror, Google comes out with Pinpoint, and all of a sudden we can do semantic search within our Google Drive. So like, that's really what I'm seeing is that back in the day, a lot of publishers were quite excited about build. But to be honest, I think the wait and see and buy approach is probably looking most sensible for most people. I think the only category of like news organization that I probably wouldn't put into that pool are those that are really concerned about like their intellectual property ownership and questions over copyright and like imbalance of relationships with tech platforms. Those are quite a distinct group, and maybe we'll take a different approach. But yeah, that's what we're seeing.
Right. And I think now is a good time to maybe talk about the intellectual property aspect to this, because that is really the big elephant in the room, isn't it? Nikita, I know you had Jeff Jarvis on your podcast talking a little bit about that New York Times lawsuit. I just wonder if you could just give us an overview and, explain kind of why this could be problematic for publishers, and how there is an element of unfairness here.
Yeah, I think when we talk about the intellectual property issues, it's really two main contexts in which we have to talk about it. The first one is the ability for large language models to train on all of this content of copyrighted news content, and then being able to produce a model that is so powerful that it also has the capability to then kind of replace the news in this way and be able to give people information, right? So that's one huge issue, is that they have been trained on all of this copyrighted data, and that's a huge ethical concern there. The other context is the ability for them to output, especially in the New York Times lawsuit, which was there, for it to be able to output almost verbatim content from the New York Times articles. And that gets into a bit different, because that's technically a flaw in the model, which is called like memorization. It has the capability to sometimes like memorize something that is very like unique. For example, a New York Times like Pulitzer Prize winning article is very unique, and it's very distinctive, and it's probably repeated quite a lot in its data set. And so it has this ability to then produce something verbatim. And this is a complete flaw within the model itself. But on the other side, for its ability to then create a model that is so powerful that it can then go and fetch the news, extract it, and be able to, as George was saying, be able to put content in readers' hand in the way that they want it. That's what these generative AI models are doing at the end. But what's the actual legal standpoint and the place where people are thinking about copyright issue at the moment has been the majority of the legal experts that I've spoken to are of the perspective that these are tools. And at the end of it, as they're considered as any AI tool, which means that the liability or any of the copyright issue, and because it is so transformative, it could be considered to be fair use in the sense that it is completely changing the output. It's training on all of this, but it's changing the output of what is possible. And the liability then lies on the user. For example, like they were putting the liability on the user to be able to prompt it to create copyrighted content. And now if you use that copyrighted content in your work, you are liable for having basically plagiarized stuff. But it's not the tool as such, because the tool was just the liability does not stand on the tool's end. So it's a very complex issue legally. At the same time, ethically, it is definitely unfair that it's been trained on copyrighted content. And as Jeff Jarvis said, it's probably a lot more from you're moving away from just like the word of like content. We're in the business of content. I think we're moving towards more of like building communities, and that's where news organizations will need to be seen, because content can be now commoditized, and that's what ChatGPT is currently being able to do. Anybody can go to a news website, copy paste it, and then produce a version of theirs on generative AI. The liability then is, as ChatGPT is saying, is not on them. It would be on the user who would be prompting it to create something as such.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's a great and really comprehensive answer. I think the only thing that I would add is something that I read the other day, actually, from Jim Olbrecht, who's ex-products or news product director, I think, at Google. And he wrote an opinion piece in the Washington Post. And it was really fascinating, that the whole thing, and he explores, whether training data is copyrightable. But I won't reflect on that because I have my own opinions. But a really interesting concept that he came up with is this idea of grounding. So basically, the way that large language models work is if they're reporting something that is a current event or something that's happened recently, what they need to do is basically double check to verify whether the facts that they're putting within the response is genuinely true or not. And in order to do that, they need what's called grounding materials, which is content that is verifiable and known to be true. So basically, his argument is that is essentially the role of news companies, which is providing the grounding materials that allow large language models to verify that their outputs are true for recent events. And the author basically makes the distinction that, okay, perhaps there's less of an argument for training data, but for this grounding data and content, that feels like there has to be a licensing deal there, and that has to be copyrighted information. And I think that's a really, really interesting distinction, actually, to like move us forward as a conversation, because no one is winning with the New York Times OpenAI lawsuit. I think if one side wins or the other wins, it's not a net positive impact, I think, to society either way, which, on the one hand, if OpenAI win, then all of a sudden, content becomes almost free to everyone to use for really many, many more purposes than they do already. And on the other side, if the New York Times wins and we have to revisit all of these amazing models that have created such great productivity, we're not winning either. So it's an interesting conundrum.
Yeah, and it does feel like legally the EU is kind of trying to be a bit more strict on this. And I think, however, and the UK, I don't know, it seems like it's somewhere in the middle. And then you have the US, which is kind of move fast to break things. I don't know if that's a proper kind of, summary of what's going on. But you're right, a conversation probably does need to be had. And yeah, I just wonder what your thoughts are on the legislation aspect of this, and where, should it be voluntary? Should there be guidelines? Or should we be really stringent, and kind of move backwards, maybe? That's my personal opinion.
I think I'm not that close to the regulation and the detail, but I think in general, everyone knows that regulation comes too late. And by the time it's written and in law, it's already out of date. So I think what we need right now is really clear guidelines and advice from governments in power, and also regulators, even without necessarily the law to back it up. But it's so challenging. I don't know how, without changing the way in which laws become enacted, you can really solve this problem with new technology like this, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with George. I think it's a huge conundrum right now in terms of understanding how this could be regulated. But I'm also of the opinion that sometimes that the training data and the ability for these large language models right now, they are serving us a purpose as well. We are able to do this is quite a transformation and quite an advancement. Where I really feel like we should be paid is in that grounding data, as you're saying, for them to be able to then be, if they want to fact check their data, and there should be some sort of licensing model to be able to support news, because we are the one at the end of the day being able to report and find those facts that then they are going to be producing. But there's a difference between the foundational model that they have created so far, which has definitely benefited us as a society in general and has transformed the entire landscape, I would say. So that part is different, I would say, from being able to now produce facts and be able to give news within their platforms. And that's something I see there should be a way to be able to create revenue as well for news.
One thing I do want to turn to and talk more about is like the financial stability of journalism and kind of subscriptions, and how AI is kind of being used to help more people on the publishing side who are kind of looking at membership subscriptions and trying to make this industry like keep the lights on essentially. And yeah, I wonder if George, you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's pros and cons to artificial intelligence in the context of like revenue models. I mean, the cons are really well publicized, so I won't dwell on them too much. I mean, the main issue is around referral traffic. You know, will generative search be the new mass disintermediation that we've all been scared of, and like the extinction event for news traffic? You know, I hope not. But will it reduce the amount of like incidental news exposure that ultimately leads to a loss of people developing a habit and then eventually becoming a subscriber? You know, potentially. In terms of the positives, they've actually been around for many, many years. I don't see huge benefits for subscription models in Gen AI. To be honest, it's more like old school, good old school artificial intelligence. So, you know, whether it's like doing some kind of propensity modeling to adapt your pricing at the point of acquisition or at the point of retention, like that's a really well-established use case. Pricing, you know, everything around pricing, around like email strategies. I've seen some are now using artificial intelligence to decide what's the best time to send someone an email based on their open rates, for example. Like these are all like neat, small optimizations that actually can accumulate to big things when it comes to improvements in reader revenue. And obviously there's like new product enhancements. I got really excited in about February last year when I met a guy called Lucky from a business called Miso AI. And they were some of the first to be building like fine-tuned large language models on top of like news content. And I remember him showing me like the search functionality for FT, if it was semantic and if it had like chatbot integrated into it. And I just remember like my mind was blown. I was like, imagine all of our corporate customers being able to ask, you know, what's happened with the share price of Disney in the last 5 years, and to get like a breakdown summary of what's happened based on FT content with links to sources. Like you could charge a huge premium for that in the context of like niche B2B information services. So like there is some really high potential upside, but those kind of bits of functionality, like that Gen AI functionality for just a generalist news organization, for me isn't quite as compelling. But you know, there are lots of optimizations that people can take advantage of.
Yeah, I see it as you mentioned, actually, a lot of like abilities for predictive paywalling, I would say. Those are the tools I think has been around. The Globe and Mail, which is Canada's leading newspaper over here, built out a tool to create like dynamic paywalling services. But one area where I see Gen AI especially maybe helping out is the ability to create new products, maybe be able to have enhanced customer service in a way, being able to build a better relationship with audience. One thing that we were actually experimenting with the Newsroom Robots podcast is like the ability for users to go and be able to chat with the podcast. And then if you come and be like, I'm an AI executive and I'm just getting started with my AI strategy, what should I do? I have so many conversations with multiple people that I've spoken to about this exact problem. They would then be able to have a summary of what's happening and then be taken to and directed to like maybe which podcast episode that they would be interested in. And then you're looking at the ability for more engagement with the podcast. Also, this might be like a paid feature for subscribers only. Again, you're having more products for users. So I see it really, the ability to create a lot more engaging user experiences might help draw people back to news, because I see I feel an outsider sometimes as a data scientist who then came into the news industry. And what I saw was the tech industry very carefully listening to the audience and developing their products so quickly and iterating on things rapidly in terms of if things are working or not working. Whereas what I see is for us, content has just been the same. Like we come onto the websites and that's it. And when we look at the number of different audience segments that we cater to, you're talking about different generations, Gen Z, Gen X, baby boomers. Like, every single person, every single generation has a different way in which they like to get their content, different types of news they're interested in, different stages of life that they are in. So if you build in stuff like recommendation algorithms, being able to give them news exactly in the way that they want, if video is something as a Gen Z, you want to view video news and you are like scrolling on TikTok, you're able to produce similar news experiences within your own app, then that brings people back to the news. So I see generative AI as really not just being used for helping to drive revenue back by bringing audience to the news.
And I wonder, say you're a small publisher in Europe and you're trying to experiment around this and think of ways to embed this. Is it worth maybe like coming together as a collective with other small publishers, in neighboring countries who can't maybe afford FT Strategies consultancy and like try and pool resources and come up with something? Because it feels like if you're not big legacy media, how do you have the funds to do this? Or if you're not a data scientist turned journalist or, going back and forth like yourself, Nikita, how do you, what are some recommendations both of you have for people in that situation?
Well, I mean, it's kind of funny that you say that, Tara, because we've worked with the Google News Initiative to launch a number of what we call programs to basically cohorts of similar publishers that are facing similar challenges and want our support. So last year, we did actually run what we called the AI design sprint, which was basically where we took, I think it was 10 to 15 publishers and hosted a whole day workshop where we basically identified like a problem that they wanted to solve and then worked with them to figure out like an AI application that could support them with it. And then since then provided some mentoring as to how they're getting on and helping with implementation. So we kind of have done that, but obviously we would love to scale it to a much greater group. And there's lots that still don't have access to that resource. Having said that, there are so many resources out there. There's a great handbook around how local journalists can use prompts with free Gen AI tools like ChatGPT, and it literally gives you like copy and paste prompts for like things you can use around like reporting and writing like your notes and bits and pieces like that. So there are a lot of tools out there, and I think it's going to be very difficult for them to do any kind of meaningful exploration or development of their own tools right now. I think that's probably a distraction rather than a good use of time, but it's all about using those free tools, experimenting with what they can offer you, and like learning, I guess. Like we ourselves spent a whole day at an offsite pretending that we were journalists and just having like the Gen AI tools available to us, like the text to text, the speech to text, etc. And like we basically pretended to be journalists for a day and see what it could do. And you do come out of that day like, oh my God, I've learned so much. So I think that would be a good exercise as well.
Yeah, I think you've touched upon the topic that I'm very passionate about and actually going to be spending my entire year on. As an ICFJ fellow, my entire focus for the year is promoting AI literacy for local media, because I think this is an absolute game changer for local news. They don't have the ability to create tech, but actually that might be a good thing because I don't think it's the time to be building right now because of how quickly the technology is evolving. There are tools coming out. You don't know what GPT, Google are going to come out with and a new feature. So instead, it's all about promoting AI literacy, in my opinion, at this stage. And that's where local news and that's where local news leaders are experimenting with. You now combine generative AI technology with no code tools like Bubble, which is like a no code platform, Glide. These are abilities where you're just dragging, dropping platforms, connecting it with an API from OpenAI. You don't need to know any kind of code. You just need to know how to log into these different platforms, create an account, copy, paste a link, and you put that all together, you're able to quickly create prototypes for yourself. So I know of a newsroom, one thing that they did for helping out with advertising and local news was they built out a platform where their sales team, all they had to do was put in a bit of information about their client and it will generate a sales email. It also generates ad copies. They did all of these like tools and built out small tools for their newsroom by using no-code tools like Retool or Zapier, like putting together all of these AI automations. And you don't need to be a data scientist. The only reason I sit and do all of that is because I'm just nerdy and like to learn a little bit more about the tech part of it. And so I experiment with it even deeper and go deeper into it. But you don't even need to be. And actually, part of it is I'm launching the Newsroom Robots Academy to be able to also teach a lot more about all of these different tools specifically for local news. Because I think when we're talking about AI and generative AI, we still have this notion that it's such a heavy technical uplift and only the big newsrooms can do it. That was true before like ChatGPT came onto the scene. And since GPT-4 has come out, I think it's like a renaissance for local news, really. We are going to see a lot more experiments. You can be like a 1 or 2 person newsrooms. And I know a lot of them who are running their entire operations by upskilling themselves on AI and building quicker tools for themselves. And I think that's the real power for generative AI right now. And that's what's going to completely change the landscape as we see it.
Yeah, like totally. I mean, anecdotally, I was talking to an Australian local news organization. It had 2 people, and they've never been able to launch a newsletter because they just don't have time. They're on the beat, they're writing articles, they're managing the website, they're doing all sorts. And, I just asked them, like, have you seen that you can copy and paste this prompt, like off this like research paper, and it will immediately turn like all of the content that you produced this week into a summary newsletter in like 30 seconds. And then, you've got to proofread it and send it out. But after that, like, it's just amazing the kind of things that you can do with such little effort now. It's really exciting.
And there are also lots of tools that are coming out specifically for local news, actually. And so you don't have to build because they are building those tools for you. There's a tool called like SEO, which is a completely free Slack workspace tool that was developed by a fellow here at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. All you have to do is drop in your article. It will generate headlines for you, SEO metadata. It will also analyze your entire SEO data, your history, and see like what was resonating with audience and give you suggestions there. So like that's one thing. And then I was speaking to another startup called Satchel AI. And what they were working on was basically being able to listen into all those city council meetings and completely make them into articles that can then supplement your local news. And again, you don't have to be able to go and build out these tools. You could just buy them and work with them. And a lot of them are currently beta testing their tools. And so that's a really good opportunity for local publishers, I say, to get in. And then there's also another the Microsoft funded a tool called Nota, which basically I know a lot of local news publishers that are using it and absolutely love it, which is taking news articles, converting that into video, social media formats, helping with newsletter. So you don't really even need to have the capacity to build tools, because all of these tools are being built for local news right now.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you for the both of you for your insight into this. And my final question would be, if you had a magic wand, what would you wish you could sort of fix and in order for this industry and in order for sort of the publishing sector to kind of really take advantage of generative AI and be more productive? And
I wish we could fix like the verification of like misinformation and disinformation. I think that's one of the existential challenges to like the news publishing business, but also like a massive opportunity, ironically, which is strange to say. I think why I say that is because mis and disinformation, could completely destroy the public's trust in the news industry, full stop. And the reality is the common person doesn't distinguish between news brands and think, oh, that one's trustworthy versus this one isn't all the time. Like that, I think many people don't see that distinction. So as an industry, we could be categorized as like untrustworthy, which is obviously really dangerous in terms of future audiences and the revenue model. But then at the same time, it represents a huge opportunity because like we are the safe harbors of like verified and good information, at least the good players. But I think the stakes are too high to play that game. And so I would love us to be able to really easily be able to tell, first of all, what is artificially generated, and then what is and isn't like misinformation and disinformation. Using AI to do that would be great.
I mean, I agree with that. I think hopefully we are able to solve or at least attempt to solve the problem of mis and disinformation with AI. But even broader from that, like just talking about the news industry in general, from a lot of my conversations, I still see a lot of fear around AI adoption. And I really hope in that this year, in the next few months, we're able to turn the narrative from this like big, I don't know, like transformer kind of robots narrative to just be able to see how it has been helping a lot more accessibility with this AI knowledge being able to help people and help local newsrooms. And so that's one way I really hope we see a lot more AI literacy initiatives. And that's why I'm so passionate about that right now, is because I think the conversation that we're having about AI and just focusing on being very cynical as we are as journalists, but at the same time, seeing the actual potential that is possible with it and how we can bring in our journalistic principles to drive that conversation and narrative ahead. So that's really one place that I'm really hoping we could focus on.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both for joining us on the Journalism Innovation Podcast. Nikita Roy, it was brilliant. George Montagu, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Hopefully see you soon.
Thank you.
A big thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in today. Want to hear more interesting perspectives on news innovation and media entrepreneurship? You can join our free Journalism Innovation Network by heading over to ejc.net/network. This initiative and podcast is powered by the European Journalism Center and supported by the Google News Initiative. I've been your host, Tara Kelly, and that's all for now. See you next time.